see everybody. Really nice to be here. It's been a long time since I've been here. I'm going to be talking about the Mental Health Act and ethnicity. What is the role of legislation in the care of people? And particularly I've been interested in ethnic disparities in the experience and outcome of mental illness for a very long time. And we know that the rates of detention for black patients are 3, 4, sometimes 6 times higher than for white patients. And I've been looking at this for almost 20 plus years, still trying to work out how to resolve this problem. There's data going back 20 years, there's data probably going back 60 years, and the problem hasn't shifted. This is in the context of rising levels of detention anyway in the UK. Detention is a term used to describe compulsory admission. And it wasn't until 2017 when there was an independent review provoked by the Prime Minister Theresa May, who wanted something done about these disparities. And there's a review of legislation which recommended we look at this very carefully, we gather experience data, better understand the problem. We can't solve the problem, we need to reanalyse the problem. On that basis, Mooney, who's my co-PI, and I set off on this project called Co-Pact to look at the rates of detention and trying to better understand what drove these higher rates amongst black patients and minorities in general. But particularly we wanted to go away, I trained as an epidemiologist, but I wanted to go away from that and look at the experience that people were having and to drill down into what actually was going on in their world which led to these detentions. That might seem like a straightforward question, but obviously these very populations are those that are underrepresented in research, don't turn up to clinics, end up being detained, don't have a good relationship with services, and certainly any research project which is potentially extractive or authoritarian in any way, they don't want anything to do with. So this is not an easy problem to solve. And we were therefore thinking very hard about how to go about this, and we decided to use a creative method alongside many other studies that I'm involved in, using photo voice. Photo voice is a participatory process where you ask people to take a picture of something that they think is relevant to their life or to the issue you're trying to look at, not necessarily of hospital wards or their care experiences, anything. And they took pictures of flowers, of streets, of shops, of friends, and so on. And the idea was then to ask them to narrate their photographs with a caption first of all, and then proceed to narrate individually and then in groups of people. And so we recruited 60 people, of whom 48 completed 3 workshops. The first was very much an induction and a caption setting process. They went away, took photographs. Some people used the disposable cameras, some people used digital cameras, some people used no cameras and just sent in poetry. We used everything that people sent in. And the idea was then to analyse that data. Again, the variety of methods to do this are vast. There's no standard framework, so we had to develop those methods as we went, using polytextual thematic analysis as our guide, but also looking at the narratives. And then we were going to use that data to co-design potential solutions, and this was done in several different places around the country. There are several other components that I won't go into. There's an economic evaluation, there's an experience evaluation for feedback, there's policy work going on as well. So broadly speaking, these are the numbers of people who participated in the generating experience data based on photo voice. And then the co-design activities involved another different bunch of 58 people from different stakeholder communities, the police, social work, clinicians, managers, policymakers, commissioners from a whole range of places, and they proceeded to co-design some solutions. This generated quite a complex data set. We've got demographic information, which we generated using a roadmap. So again, we were trying to be empowering, not extractive, not give people questionnaires, but give them a timeline and say, describe what's happened to you over time and what happened here and what happened there. And within that, we gathered their demographic data and clinical data. There were the images themselves, over 500 images from 48 individuals, narrated over 3 workshops. There were the transcripts from their conversations. Then in the co-design process, there were touch points, what's really important, what do they think would make a difference to their experience. And then there was some action plan development, which was challenging. So I'm going to give you a synthesis of the summary findings, and I'm going to go a bit later into specific images and some narratives, just to give you a feel. it's fair to say that the images and the captions are far more powerful than the synthesis I'm going to give you, because they give you a really in-depth account, a story of that person's life, and something that really matters to them in the moment. But I'm going to give you an overview first, just to orientate it. And within this, I was particularly interested in the use of police, because it came up again and again, how the police were involved in the care of people. So overall, people felt that at the time of being detained, they thought they actually needed to be detained. They weren't saying, I should never have been detained. They felt it was too late, that opportunities to support them earlier on weren't pursued. They were begging for medication, they couldn't get it. They were asking for referral to specialist services, they put on waiting lists. Whoever they talked to didn't communicate with other parts of the system. They had financial crises and social crises. If they'd had some financial advice, that would have helped, they felt. Some people were anxious and feeling unsafe, so they contacted the police. That very quickly turned into being taken in by the police. Other people had the police just arrive unexpectedly, and that's very stigmatising. Their experiences of the police involvement included handcuffs and embarrassment, but also, and I'll show you some examples, careful, nuanced, tactical, relational conversations in order to either escape the police or indeed to end up in a hospital and not the police station or prison. So people were understanding what was going on and trying very hard to get the result they wanted and still feel safe. There wasn't continuity of care. They felt people weren't really assessing them properly, that their families hadn't been involved, that they knew their relapse signatures and no one was listening to them. No one was listening to them is a recurrent theme of epistemic injustice that this group of people were feeling. They felt that people weren't picking up their symptoms in other settings, in A&E, in maternity wards, in other spaces, that in other bits of the health system or social care system, people just weren't attending to their mental health care needs. And emergency department as well, where they also talked about being unlawfully detained. So if you're not put on a section of the Mental Health Act, you shouldn't really be detained. But obviously policemen are persuasive and clinicians can be persuasive, and if you don't know what's going on in your rights, you may stay there. At the time of detention, they felt that they were very disorientated, they didn't get enough information. We know in psychosis that there's cognitive processing problems, memory problems, but no one was really explaining what was going on to them. In the UK, the wards are full of people wearing plain clothes, casual clothes. This is an attempt to reduce the power differential. They didn't like that. They didn't know who was looking after them, and they thought they were being kidnapped. You know, they woke up in a ward with all these people wandering around and didn't have a clue who these people were. And no information and no appropriate information, you know, sometimes inappropriate posters that felt for children's wards. They didn't know the scope of their freedoms. Again, I'll show you an example where a person on the ward wanted medications, the nurse was ignoring her. She asked again, asked again, asked again. After about half an hour, the nurse called the police in, the police came in. Clearly a punitive behavioural response. She ended up in isolation and medicated. I had no idea why she had to put up with that. So there's some really interesting stories about how the police got involved at various stages and things that perhaps should have happened. They also felt that the staff on wards, on the units, just weren't sufficiently skilled in the basics of looking after very fragile and vulnerable people. Now, they weren't hostile towards staff. In fact, if anything, they were very compassionate and very understanding how difficult the job this was. But they just didn't feel they were good enough. They didn't understand why they're being looked after by people who didn't have the basic communication skills or courtesies or show respect and were able to do this. This is also a very frail group, a fragile group. A significant proportion had adverse childhood experiences, multi-morbidity, many of them had children, all sorts of other factors involved. And again, making those people very difficult to get into research in the first place, and why Photo Voice we thought was an interesting way to engage them. They didn't know how to navigate the appeals process. They felt they needed advocacy, irrespective of ethnicity, family involvement again. Racialisation was an issue, racism was an issue, but it wasn't the only issue. They had a very nuanced view of how it played out and the fact that people didn't talk about this in wards sometimes. And the black staff were even more reluctant to talk about it because they themselves felt oppression and were isolated. There were differences in the culture between day and night when at night time there were lots of agency staff who weren't as skilled, who didn't know the patients very well. So the whole regime was different. There's very little going on the wards which was therapeutic. They did like the idea of being supported in prayer and religiosity, and they felt that there should have been just a general better understanding of their care needs, including their cultural needs. Some people, by being detained, were so traumatised they felt they were changed forever, and there just was no recognition of this by the clinical care team, that actually there was no therapeutic process to take account of the trauma of being detained itself. If you've already had an adverse childhood experience, obviously you're very vulnerable to having additional traumatic experiences disturb you. They wanted more support as they left. There was a bit of a cliff edge. Of course, they were delighted to get out, but suddenly there was no support. They wanted a therapeutic support to continue into the community. And they felt that community nurses, some were good, some were not so good, they felt. Similarly, there were positive and negative things said about the police at various points as well, and about paramedics as well. There were sort of comments about some of them being helpful and not. The co-designed solutions broadly were these, that they just felt there was a lack of understanding of what they needed. Despite our services costing a lot of money in a high-income country, they were still uncoordinated. People just didn't know where to go. Even professionals within the service didn't know where to go, and they felt there was a real problem there. That friends and family need to be better involved, that the discharge plans weren't really supported. And one of the recommendations from the Mental Health Act review was advanced agreements, which have been present in various ways, the idea being that you have a document which says if you are detained, how you would like to be treated in the future, and also includes your relapse signatures, and they wanted those implemented. The government hasn't made those, or the response from government to date hasn't been about making those legally, so they're not insisting on it as being a necessary legal mandate. They're kind of suggesting it should be done appropriately when and where needed. So there's a bit of discretion, there's a bit of reluctance to do that. We're in the middle, as you know, of an election. There will be a new government, and there's hope that might change with time. They really felt there should be new standards of inpatient care. The assumption that our generic trainings are sufficient for caring for very traumatised people who have been detained was problematic for them. They really felt the standards of training and care weren't there, that they needed to be humanised, and staff needed support to function better in those sorts of environments. And they wanted better access to talking therapies. Now, these were the broad co-designed interventions taken away by each of the stakeholders involved in the co-design process, and they've taken them back into their numerous local committees. Overall, this is broadly what we're pushing for to change the way things are done. But locally, they are doing things differently. For example, we've heard a bit about medical gaslighting yesterday. There was a concern about how their records didn't reflect actually what had taken place. For example, being taken to hospital in the back of a black van with no signage was problematic for some people, particularly with plainclothes folk looking after them. So that's been decommissioned, that particular element of the care system. So lots of little things are happening, but overall a structural response is required. And indeed, we came to this because we thought about clinical communication, we thought about cultural formulations, we thought about belief systems, we thought about misunderstandings. None of that was really pertinent. This was a structural problem, a systems problem in society, and I'll talk more about that later. So these were the few people who mentioned the police specifically and had an image related to them. I'm just going to show you some images quickly. So they didn't assess me properly, the police were called and things escalated, took me to the station, from there they took me to intensive psychiatric unit. I needed the right professionals at the right time. I don't like wasting people's time, so I only asked for help when I really need it. Caused a big problem, and one policeman got injured because there was a struggle. A lot of communication about feeling like being in a zoo, feeling like animals, being locked up, not being looked after, and force being used a lot. And we know de-escalation techniques can be helpful and can be used, and some models of care suggest you get rid of mental health legislation altogether. But the consequences are quite severe. They felt very punitive, that people were in there for much longer than they'd originally expected to be in there. Again, images from people. I'm a customer, but I've never been treated as one. Coming through the police route, you're guilty as charged. Conformance is the only way out, and it could happen to us all. There are people in there who are in need of help, but really, do they get the attention that they deserve? This was of a caged cat. This individual was saying, you know, I felt like a caged cat. I was outside playing, I could have fun, I was doing what I wanted to. I need my freedom, but this is how I felt once I was admitted to a hospital ward, and I couldn't really, you know, to go from doing whatever I wanted, catching mice figuratively, to being detained and not having the opportunity, made me behave like a wild animal. So there is a whole literature on institutions and how people can regress and start pushing up against the boundaries of those places. Lost in translation represents a loss of meaning and context between language and culture when histories are taken, relevant to the conversations this morning. Seen inappropriate detentions of patients on section 136. 136 is when the police pick you up on the street, they can take you to a place of safety. And if you're in your home, they can't enter your home without a 135 section, and a social worker is normally involved, but normally the police are the people that take you there and wait with you until you're handed over. When the police bring you there, it's forensic, different ball game. They have to take you. I've been to the hospital 3 times of that because I know I shouldn't say this really, but I know how to play the mental health card to get the maximum. I was doing it for years, so I play the card in the hospital where I want to be at my leisure. You feel me? When I get nicked, I could get arrested, depends what I'm arrested for. I might play the mental health card and then they can't touch you. So there's a whole narrative about how that's safer than getting into a prison setting or being in a prison cell. And there's a very, you know, active sort of tactics to escape coercion and escape the police and what might happen to them. Didn't know why I was there, they never explained it. The police said basically I was having the police on myself because I thought somebody was trying to get into my house. So they came after an hour speaking to me, do you mind going in the ambulance van? I thought they were going to kidnap me, asking me to go into the ambulance van. They didn't tell me where I was going because I refused. They arrested me, put me in the van, brought me to a ward in section. Didn't speak the whole way, put me in a room without speaking to anyone, just brought me through the doors at the back of the ward and sat me in a room. And that's a conversation going on between people. So this is the example of the person not getting the medication and the nurse calling the police onto the ward to contain. Now, it's possible that the narrative that the person is giving isn't entirely accurate. You know, it's always possible that actually they're minimising their own view. This was discussed very slowly over time. I don't really buy that. I think these were authentic accounts people were giving of their experience of what had gone on. And it felt very much that the staff were unable to care and provide the interventions at the right time and ended up offering a punitive response. And so this shouldn't really be happening, and it's wonder why. So there's a lot more data I could present, so I'm not going to. I know we're also short of time. So these are the sorts of issues that raised for me. Why are the police involved? I've been involved in mental health systems for 20 plus 30 years and never really thought about it. Police were quite good at picking out who was needing care and taking people along, were sensitive, you know, and generally avoided overdoing or underdoing it, and often they reassured me. If I thought someone had a firearm, they would go in first. If I thought someone had a knife, you know, generally I thought they were quite a reasonable bunch, and generally if they pick you up, there's a purpose to them. Should they be involved? How can they be avoided? What are the impacts on people? Clearly they feel criminalised, and black patients are getting more of this, and they're already subject to more stop and search powers. We're seeing they're very traumatising, particularly young black youth. Different study, we're looking at that at the moment. How do people position themselves when the police get involved? How can we equip them to respond to police involvement? So this is also about fearing for their own safety. They know when the police get involved, things can go very wrong for them, and what do they need to do relationally. A very good colleague of mine who's a professor in education, who's also autistic, black, often says that he's super nice to people, over polite, because he knows if you put him in the back of a car, he's going to lose it, and he's going to end up being contained. So he has to be constantly narrating what's going on around him and thinking about it, which is an additional pressure. So, and this is what the police are struggling with. That, you know, a third of people in police custody have some sort of mental health problem, and they feel they're not best equipped to deal with it. The numbers of people on these 136 sections has gone up. Racial and minoritized populations were overrepresented. There are several co-response models where nurses are going out with the police, not necessarily being scaled up, but there's lots of variability and variability in the way these are evaluated. And not a lot of these evaluations are necessarily research evaluations, and they don't really make it into the public domain a lot of the time. And policy gets made very quickly on the back of these evaluations. So black people more often subject to police use of firearms, police restraints, deaths in custody, and taking people to a place of safety. And the rates of police involvement are concerning given the evidence of criminalisation, shame and guilt as well. The police brought in this right care, right person approach, which I think was, frankly, they don't want to be involved. They're actually saying, we're over-involved, why you keep calling us? You know, we can't help you. We're too busy, we've got other things to do, we've got crimes to solve. And you're asking us to sit in emergency departments waiting for you to do your assessments. And so on average, 14 hours it takes in an emergency department, 8.5 at a health-based place of safety, when they're just sitting there with the patient. Over 10,000 hours they estimated in one region, and over 1 million hours sat with people in that one region. And when they did introduce a right care, right person approach, which essentially reinforced the criteria by which they should be involved and not, and there was a slightly higher bar rather than simply a nurse or a doctor wanted them involved. And the bar was this: to investigate a crime that occurred or is occurring, to protect people when there is a real and immediate risk to the life of a person or person to be subject to or at risk of serious harm. So just by introducing those thresholds, they managed to reduce the numbers of calls they had to attend. Now, this wasn't a popular policy because it was pretty much unilaterally done, and they did suggest this was agreed more broadly, but the health system hadn't really been consulted in the process. They also thought that, you know, mental health practitioners could be licensed to detain. The legislation shouldn't be just about crisis. We've got this beautiful crisis system, and the evidence is every time you change legislation, the rates of detention go up, because everyone's focused on doing this better and being legally compliant with what's going on. Suicide prevention and use of weapons, that's something they definitely want to be involved with. There's a real lack of balance in the care system, the supports, community support, sufficient support and intervention and prevention, and a lack of trained staff. And worry about accountability when it goes wrong, who's responsible. So we know that increasingly people are being detained because people are practicing in a risk-averse way. Now, this isn't an accident. This is a beautiful book by Peter Barham, a historian, who's looked at psychiatric institutions and found that psychiatric institutions have been used to criminalise for hundreds of years. Wherever you look, he's got very detailed examples of how they've been used and how the legislation and the purpose is entirely rationalised, hence the title, Outrageous Reason. Everything's reasoned, but the reasons don't really add up historically, and there are conditioned responses to which we're all accustomed, and we don't see what we're conditioned to. So drapetomania, you will know, is a diagnosis in times of slavery when slaves are running away, they would have their foot chopped off, but there was a law. That was the treatment for slaves running away, because that was really odd. That must be an illness, mustn't it? And we've got equivalents currently in our current world that we aren't aware of, we're not paying attention to. So that's the worry, that we're continuing to do something like that. Doreen Joseph is a colleague of mine. She's a co-investigator on the project, and she's had a history of mental illness herself, perinatal psychosis, very articulate, and is involved in several projects and several boards, and we've wrote this chapter together for a book from the Royal College of Psychiatrists on mind, state and society. And her recurrent theme is that the problem is in the system. She's constantly being victimised, pathologised, invisibilised, criminalised and demonised. in some shape or form. And so these sort of traditions continue somehow, and it makes me think, well, how can we redesign a system without the police? Neil Armstrong's a really interesting person. He's an anthropologist and philosopher, currently in the Department of Philosophy at Oxford. He's about to move to SOAS in London. He's also been a patient, and he's open about that. So he's written this really interesting book on collaborative ethnography. And he's written with several other people who have been patients, but also professionals. And so they've got an insider and an outsider view of both perspectives. And he's struck by the double morality, is what he calls it, the secular theodicy, about the trade in secrets. That actually, we all know the systems aren't as good as they should be. We wouldn't want to be in them ourselves. We wouldn't want our children to be. You know, we're aware of that, but somehow when you're, when you're detained legally, because you're following the legislation, somehow we feel our job is done. We're compliant with the legislation, and there's some sense of inevitability of the pain of that, and we don't even question it. And when I've talked to trainees, it's like, well, isn't that obvious? It's going to be horrible. What can we do about it? As opposed to how can we make this more helpful and supportive. He talks about the disciplinary project of the state, and actually it's relevant to DSM as well. There's a project going on, someone else's project that impacts on us, and that people are methodologically detached and disorientated. There's this trade in secrets. He also uses the term bullshit, which for him is a philosophical term, to mean insincerity, deep insincerity. We know what's going on. So when you talk to someone on a ward in a professional role, they talk one way. You talk to them on the street, in a pub, or reading a book in a book club, it's a different kind of conversation. So we are aware, but we don't seem to act on that, we don't seem to have the power to do that. And he broke away from the system himself. He said, look, I don't need this. So in summary, race was an additional layer of disadvantage for racialised populations, an additional form of trauma, but it wasn't the only thing, and racism does get enacted in our systems. It's merged with the criminal justice system, it's merged with institutions as well. The guidance around what constitutes a place of safety is based on being in a sort of emergency department, which isn't always helpful. More work is needed about collaboration and preventive opportunities that all these people felt were helpful, and more could have been done earlier on. But it's not that they don't want help, they just don't want the kind of help they're getting at the moment. They're not getting de-escalation at the right time. And there's all sorts of implications for future research, more detailed analysis of the police engagement that we're undertaking. But other things as well, like children. If you're a parent and your child is watching you be detained, and you've got a genetic component and a social component and vulnerability, and then you're watching your parent being detained, it's an added adverse experience. Your vulnerability is higher, but we have no standard policies for how we're going to support children, or pets for that matter. So brilliant social workers look after your pets, but it's not mandated. If they can manage that, they do. So thank you very much. That's a kind of slightly quick gallop, but hopefully that's given you a flavour of the project and what we're trying to do. And just to thank all my colleagues. It's a massive team of people who are involved in the project.